Hello, everybody, and welcome. My name is Ken West, and I'm a professor in the Department of Economics here at UW-Madison, and I'm here in my role as director of something called the Julie Plant Granger Institute for Economic Research. On behalf of my colleagues in the Economics Department, I'd like to welcome you to this talk by Dana Peterson on U.S. megatrends and outsized risks. Before I introduce Dana, I'd like to go over a little bit of background and housekeeping details. The talk is sponsored by the Julie Plant Granger Institute for Economic Research. The Institute was funded by a generous gift by David Granger and the Granger Foundation in honor of his wife, Julie Plant Granger, who got a BA in economics from UW-Madison in 1948. The Institute funds a number of activities on campus. Most of these are not quite visible to the general public. These include undergraduate and graduate scholarships and support for research by economists in the department, and outreach to the public as exemplified by today's talk. Today's talk is on the state of the economy. It is our second annual State of the Economy talk. The last one happened 3 years ago. Something called COVID got in the way. But we hope to have this annually, and it is a series in which we bring in a distinguished economist from outside UW-Madison to tell us what's going on with the economy. All right, a bit about logistics, including question and answer. We expect the talk to take about an hour. After the talk, there's a reception over there, which you're all welcome to come and get some snacks and mingle and ask face-to-face questions with the speaker or with any of the many economists from our department who are here. In terms of questions and answers during the talk, we ask that you hold those till the end. So at your seat, there's a little piece of paper here. As Dana is speaking, if a question comes to mind, by all means, write it down on the piece of paper before you forget. Don't wait to the end, you might forget. And pass it down to the end of the row. And we have two graduate students in econ, Nisha Chikel and Phil Coyle, who will be collecting the questions and reading them off. If you feel comfortable with it, please put down your name, class, and major. If you don't feel comfortable with it, that's fine. We can ask the question without necessarily associating it with you. There's also a question on there asking you how you heard about this event and whether or not you're asking a question. If you have time to fill that out, we'd appreciate it. All right, at last, on to the main event. Dana Peterson is Chief Economist and Center Leader of Economy, Strategy, and Finance at the Conference Board. The Conference Board, for those of you who are not familiar with it, is a nonpartisan, not-for-profit business membership and research think tank. Dana's research on the U.S. and global economy is featured regularly and prominently in the news media. Her views and interpretation of economic events have been spotlighted in many, many media outlets, including, among others, the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, CNBC, CNN, Fox Business, and Bloomberg. Prior to the Conference Board, Dana served as North American economist and later global economist at Citi, and before that, she worked at the Federal Reserve Board in Washington. Last, and certainly not least in terms of her bona fides in making this presentation, Dana got her master's in economics from the University of Wisconsin in 2002. So you know she's well prepared to give this talk. Talking to her earlier, I discovered she has not been back to campus since 2002. So let me ask you to join me in welcoming Dana Peterson back to campus.
Thanks so much for the fantastic introduction, Professor West. And he told me to call him Ken. I feel a little weird. But also I see you, Professor Hansen. We're on a few clubs like NBEAC and NBER together, so it's great seeing you as well. And I actually was in one of your classes 20 years ago. So I'm just so impressed by this audience that, a bunch of young people want to hear about the dismal science, but that's great because you're all many of you are looking to become economists, and I think that's fantastic. So I've been asked to talk about the U.S. economy, what's going on right now, what do we expect, and hopefully, with my 100 slides, I won't go to 2 hours because there's food over there and I want you to get to that food. No, I'm just joking. The whole thing's an hour. I'm going to leave time for Q&A and looking forward to a very interactive discussion. So the US outlook is basically being buffeted by these mega trends, right? So the pandemic is still with us, not so much in terms of us wearing masks, because we're only a few people are. I definitely wore one on the plane. But certainly in China, the pandemic is still a huge issue for them, and they have something called the dynamic zero tolerance COVID policy. So whenever there's an aggregation or some critical mass of persons who are infected with COVID, entire cities are shut down. And so that affects supply chains, right? So, and the US imports a ton of goods from China. So if there's no production because no one's going to work because they're locked down and there are no shipments, that means you have a shortage. And Econ 101 tells you shortages are a lack of supply, and so that means, or there's an imbalance between supply and demand, and so you're gonna have higher inflation. We also have the war in Ukraine. You know, it's a humanitarian crisis. It's still raging. We're not sure when it's going to be over. But certainly the war has created a lot of disruptions in terms of production of food and energy. Food production, especially grains and oils for cooking, a lot of those things are produced in Ukraine and they're subsequently shipped around the world, especially to the Middle East. But the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. But it also matters for a lot of products that are made here in the US. And indeed, energy prices have been buffeted by the fact that Russia is undergoing, well, they're being subjected to sanctions because of the war in Ukraine. And energy prices are typically determined at a global level. You can have some regional variability, but certainly prices are affected by what's going on globally. And so we're seeing inflation due to that. You'll notice that there's this key term I keep using, inflation, and that's really a big part of what's happening here in the US now and what's going to be happening and how the economy is going to evolve over the next 12 to 18 months. And so with the pandemic and the war, you're seeing these supply chain disruptions, elevated inflation for commodity prices, for transportation prices, and that's all feeding through to consumer prices. And so that affects how much consumers purchase, so that affects demand. But also central banks are responding, and in the US it's the Federal Reserve, is responding by tightening monetary policy. Now the Fed's doing that 3 ways: through forward guidance, which is essentially speech. So you'll see Chair Powell go to Jackson Hole and make a fiery speech, and everyone responds to that. That's also called moral suasion, but forward guidance is actually a policy tool that was adopted back during the last big recession. They're also raising interest rates, which is, the typical tool that the central bank uses. And the goal is to slow demand. So if interest rates are higher, it's much more expensive to go out and buy a home or to finance a car or furniture. And even for businesses especially, it's much more expensive to finance investments in capital and labor. So we're seeing the Fed respond to very elevated inflation with higher interest rate hikes. Meanwhile, we have very serious demographic issues in the US where we don't have enough workers as a share of the number of people who are retiring. So that's creating labor shortages. And labor shortages are a supply problem. You don't have enough individuals supplying themselves to businesses to work. And we'll talk about why that's happening. And so all of this is coalescing into a huge problem for the US and also the rest of the world. But I'm mainly going to focus on the US. And so our biggest call, I would say, for the US is we do expect a recession, but it's going to be a weird one. It's going to be a recession where you're probably not going to see a lot of unemployment, and that's unusual, and I'm calling it a job-full recession. We're used to hearing about job-less recoveries, but this could be a job-full recession. So I don't think I made that up, but I'm using it anyway. So there are definitely key risks around that base case of a recession, proper, meaning the NBER, stating yes, it's a recession, and we think the recession proper is going to begin in the fourth quarter of this year and extend to the first quarter of next year. So very brief, and potentially very shallow, meaning it's not very deep in terms of drag on various economic indicators. It could be widespread across industries, but certainly not very long or very deep. But we have these risks around even that depressing base case. Hopefully I can end on a happy note, or at least we'll have food, right? Looking forward to the food. You could have escalation of the war in Ukraine, meaning the war spills out beyond Ukraine's borders, right? And it starts pulling in NATO allied economies in Europe, and that would also pull in the US. So we'd have a bigger conflict, including the US. But also geopolitics. So there's a lot of discussion around tensions between the US and China. And the US and China see each other as strategic competitors, just to put it nicely, where they're competing over a lot of issues in terms of trade, high tech, intellectual property, but also disagreements over sovereignty of certain economies. And so that's a big risk. Together, geopolitics and active wars, but also higher inflation. This morning we received the CPI data, which is a pretty common gauge of looking at inflation in the US. And the CPI is a consumer price index, and it's essentially a measure, one of many, of how much you and I pay when we go to the store to buy things, right? And that measure has been rising very aggressively, and it's not cooling off. It surprised lots of people who forecast it. They said, well, this is going to be a good report, and it just wasn't. And we're going to talk about what's driving inflation. But certainly mistakes from the Fed. Maybe the Fed raises interest rates too much, drives the US into a recession that's too deep, and does more than it should. Having worked at the Fed, they're super smart people, but they're also people, and people make mistakes sometimes. The recession that we're calling for could be worse. It could be longer. And we still think that there are going to be labor shortages that are going to influence how much the inflation is in the economy, and also how far the Fed goes. And then some other things here, like industrial policies, which I'm not going to get into, but essentially it's when the government tells businesses where they can put their factories and where they can situate their supply chains. So that causes problems. We're not going to talk about that today. And then there's greening. What do I mean? Well, we're moving away from fossil fuels use towards renewables, but that's going to take a while. I know we're talking about 2030 and 2050 goals. It could be even longer than that. And even in that transition, it's going to be very costly, right? So that's a generator of inflation. So I think the story here is all about inflation. So these are the big themes. I'm going to spend some time showing you pictures and walking you through the pictures. And again, if you have questions, go ahead and write them down, and we'll talk about it during the Q&A. All right, so here's a picture. On the left-hand side, we have another measure of inflation. This is called the Personal Consumption Expenditure Deflator. That's a lot of words, but essentially, for those of you who are macroeconomists or aspiring to be a macroeconomist, you had GDP. GDP is made up of consumers, businesses, governments, and foreign demand for US goods and services. And basically, the Personal Consumption Expenditure Deflator measures the price of goods and services that consumers are buying, right? And this is actually the measure that the Fed pays attention to when they're adjusting monetary policy. So you can see that the solid lines, so you have the overall measure, which is the navy blue line, and then the light blue line we call core, because we remove food and energy, because food and energy are very volatile. But the Fed looks at both of these, and you can see they spiked really high, okay, in a very short period of time. And the Fed's optimal target for inflation is 2%, but you can see we're well above 2%. And then the dotted lines are what we think the forecast is going to be through the end of next year. And if you look really closely, those dotted lines don't get back to 2%. Not next year. We think that sometime in 2024, Or even the Fed may give up and say, well, this is good enough. We're kind of in a range between 2 and 3% inflation, and by the way, the economy is really souring, so maybe we'll just, stop. But essentially the Fed in the interim is going to continue raising interest rates to deal with inflation, to make sure inflation gets back closer to its target. And there are a number of reasons for why the Fed wants to do this. Well, number one, the Fed wants to lower the actual rate of inflation back to 2%. They also want to make sure something called inflation expectations remain anchored. Now, that's a lot of jargon. So essentially, these two series on the other side are a measure of what consumers think, or where consumers think inflation's going to go. So if consumers think that inflation's going to be high forever, then they start behaving that way, right? And you don't want those expectations to become embedded in everything that they do. And so the Fed wants to bring down these expectations measures. So the navy blue line is over the next 12 months, that's the measure from the conference board. The light blue line is from the New York Fed, that's over the next 3 years. They want to bring these measures down to keep inflation expectations low. The Fed also wants to prevent something called a wage price spiral, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But essentially, you can think of a wage price spiral as a vicious circle, right, where inflation prices just keep going up and up and up. So imagine some of you may work for professors, and you go to the store, you notice prices for everything are rising, so you go to your professor and say, "Excuse me, professor, may I please have a raise?" And your professor's afraid of losing you because he or she or they have a lot of work to do, and so they say, "Okay, I'm going to give you a raise," right? And so they give you a raise, but then the professor has a budget, and so the professor says to the dean, "Well, we need to raise tuition because I had to give all of my TAs a raise." And so the university raises tuition, but guess what? Who's paying tuition? Your TAs. And so your TAs are like, "Oh my gosh, tuition's going up. I need a raise because tuition is higher and everything I buy at the store is higher, so I'm going to go back to my professor, ask for a raise," and you just start the circle all over again. That's really simplistic. You have other factors in there, but the point is that you have this inflationary spiral that's bad, right? Because if prices are too high, people stop consuming after a while, and that weighs on the economy. And also expectations for inflation start to rise, where people think that inflation's going to be high forever, and you could even have something called hyperinflation. I mean, we haven't had that in the US, I think, in 100 years. You can go back and look historically at Germany before the World War, in and around the World Wars, but the point is, too much of a good thing, is bad, right? Too much inflation is bad. So the Fed wants to do that. The other reason is that the Fed wants to maintain its credibility. The reason why prices were so low since the early 1980s is that the Fed was able to convince the American people that they can keep prices low, stable, and predictable. Now, low, stable, and predictable is language that the Bank of Canada uses, but it still applies here in the US, where people expect prices to be in a certain range and only rise but so much. And so if the Fed doesn't address inflation and inflation expectations become unanchored, then they lose credibility, right? And then you have financial distress, right? And you have economic distress, and you don't want that. So this is what we think the Fed's going to do. We have the chart on the left-hand side, and that is the federal funds rate, and every other interest rate in the US is based upon this foundational interest rate. So we think they're going to raise this rate to a range of 3.75 to 4%. And this chart just takes the middle point of the range, and so that's why it's just below 4, but let's say to 4%. That's really high and really fast. If you look at the past rate hike cycles, they happened over a number of years, right? And even the last one, I can't see that very well, but it looks like at least 4 years. Meanwhile, the Fed right now is raising interest rates to 4%, 400 basis points in 1 year. So that's really aggressive, again, to address very high inflation. And so because we think the Fed is going to raise rates very aggressively, we're expecting a recession. So look at the chart on the other side. That's our forecast for GDP each quarter on an annualized basis. Annualized just means that you assume that the entire year happens in that one quarter, right? That's all that means. But you see the two red bars. Now you're saying to yourself, well, you have two negative bars in the first and second quarter. You know, doesn't that mean we had a recession in the first half of this year? I would say no, because that's not the only measure that you look at in order to determine a recession. And here in the US, we pay attention to the NBER, and the name is escaping me. But essentially, they're this organization that has a dating committee for business cycles. We know business cycles and economic cycles go up and down, and they basically are the arbiters of when we have a recession or when we reach a peak in the economy or a trough. And they look at many indicators. They don't just look at GDP. They look at employment, labor market indicators. They look at income growth. They also look at business activity. So they take a battery of indicators and they look at them and they say, well, it meets one or more of three criteria, right? So either it's very deep, right? Meaning you have a really big drop in activity, which is what happened during the pandemic. So that's depth. They look at duration, like how long is the weakness? The pandemic was weird. They said that, you know, the real weakness lasted 3 months, right? Other recessions can be longer, right? So you can have fewer than 2 quarters of very weak negative growth and call a recession. And then also the third thing is diffusion, like how widespread is the weakness? And one way to look at that is at different industries, like is manufacturing suffering, are hotels and restaurants suffering, et cetera. And so they take all the information and they determine if there's a recession. So in the first quarter, you could argue, well, you know, all those pieces of information, they're telling us that, yeah, we probably didn't have a recession in the first quarter, right? Because when you looked at domestic demand, which is all the spending and investment among consumers, businesses, and the government, plus what foreign, so those things. Essentially, it was positive, very positive, in that most of the weakness was in international trade and inventories. And inventories essentially collapsed during the pandemic, and then last year, in the later part of the year, businesses were trying to restock. But if you restock less in the second quarter relative to the first quarter, and then each quarter you're purchasing fewer inventories or accumulating fewer inventories, that's represented as a negative on GDP. And that's pretty much what we had in the first quarter. We had a lot of imports because of Omicron, and everybody sat home and bought stuff from abroad, and you had the changes in inventories. But domestic demand was still very strong. Second quarter, maybe there was domestic demand was slightly negative, and you had a lot of weakness across a number of areas, right? So consumers didn't buy as much. Businesses didn't invest in structures or equipment. Also, the government contribution was negative because the government wasn't sending people checks anymore. So maybe there was weakness, but the labor market was still doing okay. So the jury's out. We'll find out from the NBR at some point. But we think that the NBR is going to say that, yes, we will, yes, look back on the fourth quarter of this year and the first quarter of next year and say, yes, recession. I'm spending a lot of time explaining things. I hope this is helpful. But if you need me to, okay, good. I see some shaking heads. It means you're still awake. Awesome, thank you. All right, so we're expecting a recession. Normally, you would think the unemployment rate would pop up, but we're saying that maybe it won't. So On the left-hand side, we have the unemployment rate from 2019, right? So we were around 4%. That's really low, that's really good. Then you had the pandemic, everyone got laid off, and then back to 2022, we're back just below 4%. And then over the next year, we think, well, maybe we'll go back to 4%. That would be spectacular, right? If we could have a recession without tons of layoffs. And the reason why we don't think there are going to be tons of layoffs is because we have labor shortages, which I mentioned earlier. Why do we have labor shortages? I'll explain that in a couple of minutes, but we do, and it's something new and different from previous recessions over the last 100 years or so. But certainly labor shortages are a function of how many available people there are to work. And if we look at the chart on the right-hand side, this is labor force participation for the folks who are looking to become labor economists. And the participation rate is basically the number of people who are either working or looking for work divided by, I think, the population. If I get that wrong, somebody raise your hand and say you're wrong. I got a thumbs up, awesome. And so we don't like to look at the overall measure, we like to look at pieces. So we have one piece, which are people who are 25 through 54. We call that the working age population, right? You could also look at folks who are 15, but, you know, I didn't really have a job. I had summer jobs, but they didn't count. But this is the core working population. And they're starting to get back to the rate of where they were before the pandemic. But then the light blue line, those are people who are working who are 55 and older. Their index is going in the wrong direction. They're not coming back. Lots of people retired early, and they're not coming back to the labor market. And so that means because you have all these people retiring and not enough young people to really accommodate the retirements, you have these labor shortages. And so that's going to be a problem for the US, not just now, but in the future. So the Conference Board loves to do surveys. So we actually asked a bunch of CEOs of Fortune 500 companies and big national companies, what do you expect in terms of the labor market for the US? Now, before I tell you that, 93% of them expect a recession over the next 12 to 18 months. Because we asked them, do you think there's going to be a recession? They said yes. Back in the springtime, we asked them again, well, if there's a recession, you know, what's it gonna look like? Most of them think it'll be brief and not too bad. Some of them think it's gonna be a disaster, but altogether, 93% of them still say there will be a recession. Yet, they're still looking to hire people, right? You can see that even though the shares are a little bit smaller, which are the blue bars, they're still pretty decent. And a number of them, 37%, said they're not going to do anything. So they're not going to let people go. They're not going to hire either. So it's good if they're not going to let people go. And then we asked them, are you still going to have trouble finding qualified people? And many of them, the blue bars, are saying, yes, we still think we're going to have difficulty hiring people, which speaks to the labor shortage. Even though there's a recession coming, they're like, we're still going to hire people, and we still think it's going to be hard to hire those people. And then we asked them, well, what do you think about wages? Do you think you're still going to have to raise wages? And they're saying yes. And so you wouldn't be raising wages unless you were either afraid of people quitting or not being able to find the right workers. And so these are signals that the labor market may survive this next recession and may only weaken a little bit and still remain very strong. And I nicknamed it the job-full recession. Many of you, have heard of jobless recoveries, but this may be a job-full recession. Not a technical term. Okay, so what are some risks? And there are a lot. So, we could have a worse recession. So ignore all the other stuff and just look at the green rectangle. So we think there's going to be a US recession mainly because the Fed is raising interest rates to a very high level very quickly. And so I just drew a little arrow to point to, that's our base case or our main scenario. But you can have other things go really bad at the same time too. So a housing slump. Some of you may not, well, you would have been born, but you've been very young when we had the last big housing slump. And home prices fell very dramatically. They fell about 30% over a few years. And you had a lot of construction that didn't happen because of that. And consequently, you had not enough supply. So here comes a pandemic and interest rates fall to zero, mortgage rates collapse, people want more space, because they're working from home. And so you had this big run up in housing activity during the pandemic. And whenever you have more demand, in this case for housing, but insufficient supply, meaning not enough new homes and existing homes, then prices rise very aggressively. So home prices are very high. If any of your parents or any of you, grad students have been trying to buy a home, it's been tough because prices are very high. Well, now the Fed's raising interest rates, so now we're seeing mortgage rates rise, which make it much more difficult to finance a home. Affordability is down because the homes are too expensive, and so that means you have an imbalance, and so prices are gonna fall. So we think prices are gonna fall. They could fall, again, 30%, but instead of over a few years, maybe it's condensed, right? Because we saw prices spike and almost go vertical in 1 year, 1.5 years. But I think the US economy could handle home prices going down. The problem is if you have a financial crisis married with that, right? So if we go back to the Great Recession, that was caused by a housing collapse, but also a financial crisis because of the housing collapse. So let's say for some reason, I won't get into too much, there is, a collapse in housing activity and it sparks a financial crisis, right? So that's a bad scenario. Also, what if the Fed raises interest rates even higher than we're forecasting, right? What if they go to 5%? Well, that's gonna be worse for the economy, right? So that's another downside risk. You could have even higher inflation. Everyone was hoping with the July inflation reports that we had peaked and everything's gonna be great going forward, and then we got a painful reminder today that there are a lot of forces out there that are causing inflation to be elevated, and it may be really tough for the Fed to bring inflation down. Then we have, something called infrastructure spending delay. Last year, the current administration passed this big infrastructure bill. It said a trillion, but really it's only like 500 billion in new dollars. But either way, it's still money, right? And we said, well, we think some of that money will be outlaid in the second half of this year. Well, when we look at the data, it doesn't seem to be happening. So that means that takes away from growth because government spending does generate growth. It also generates inflation, but we'll talk about that another time. But anyhow, so if that doesn't happen, and certainly if there's a global recession, the US can be impacted through confidence channels. So basically how businesses and people feel about it can affect their activity. Also, if there are financial crises and disruptions that kind of cause contagion, which just basically means it filters and spills over and affects the US, then that's a problem. And also it affects the US through trade. We don't do a ton of trade in terms of exporting, we mainly import, but still, every little bit counts. And so all these things could make the situation in the US worse. So here's what we're talking about. On the right-hand side, we asked CEOs, how many of you expect a recession in the US? 93% said yes, 7% said no. How do consumers feel about it? Well, we also produce a consumer confidence measure, which is probably the most famous thing that we do, and Wall Street likes to trade on it. We have an expectations measure, which is a light blue line. And anytime it falls below that yellow line, which is 80, usually a recession happens. So consumers expect something bad around the corner. So consumers, households, consumers/households and businesses all expect a recession coming. All right, so there's a lot going on here, but the recession can be worse than we expect. Remember those different scenarios I talked about 2 slides ago? And it could be deeper and it can be longer, right? So what we did was we ran a bunch of scenarios. The worst scenario is the green line where we just throw everything in there, right? The Fed goes, inflation's higher than expected. The Fed goes to 5%. You have some kind of a housing collapse. And you also have a financial markets shock, which is that VIX shock. VIX just means it's a measure of volatility in the stock market, right? So the stock market can go up or down, but you have day-to-day volatility, right? And that's basically how markets are feeling. So that's a shock. So we threw that all in there. And so you could have a deeper recession over the course of next year, and you don't really get out of it until maybe the end of next year or the year after. Our yellow scenario, that's our upside. That's what if inflation comes down, right? And the light blue line in the middle, that's our base case. So the way you would look at this is say, well, risks, upside and downside risks are more tilted to the downside, right? Because not only can you think of more things that can go wrong, but when you put it into a model, it gives you much weaker growth, right? So that's something that some of you might do if you become macroeconomists, especially if you become business economists. Okay, so another risk, I talked about higher inflation. So I split this list up. So the first half are things that really influenced inflation during the pandemic. Some of them are demand drivers, like demand for goods, because everyone was sitting at home. Some of them are also demand for housing because interest rates were super low. And some things are supply side. So for example, factories closing in China because of COVID means you didn't have enough product being made, and so you have this supply shock, right? And also commodity prices spiking due to the war. Again, if prices are too high and you don't have the product, if you don't have the product, prices are higher, that's a supply shock. So you had supply and demand shocks, plus you had very easy monetary policy, meaning the Fed cut interest rates to zero, among other things, and fiscal policy was very easy because the federal government was sending checks to households, sending money to businesses, and also supporting state and local governments. Now, a lot of this stuff is kind of behind us. We still have some remnants of supply chain disruptions and commodity price spikes, but going forward, or at least over the next 12 to 18 months, we think there's going to be now more demand for services. Why? Because we're all sitting here with no masks on, you've come back to school, you're going on vacation, you're going to restaurants, you're staying at hotels, you're going to sporting events, you're doing everything outside, right? And engaging in what we call in-person services. So you have to be there in person to enjoy that thing. And so that means that there's a lot going to be very strong demand for services, but hey, we don't have enough workers. So you have an imbalance of supply and demand, and so prices for services are rising. Energy price volatility, right? And I think that's going to be with us for a long time, certainly as we transition away from fossil fuels towards renewables. And certainly if you look at Europe, they're experiencing that like overnight because Russia said, you know what? We don't like the sanctions, so we're going to turn off the spigots to natural gas. And so Europe is all of a sudden having to either transition to renewables, go back to using coal, or reopen their nuclear power plants, and even rationing, right? And so in the US, we're seeing some of that also because there are fewer and fewer investments in fossil fuels, yet we still need fossil fuels, right? How many of us are driving around electric cars? Very few, unless you live in New Jersey, everybody owns a Tesla. But anyhow, But, elevated transportation costs, semiconductor shortages. What's a semiconductor? It's just a computer chip, right? And we use computer chips in everything. All of you have cell phones, I'm pretty sure. All of you have toasters at home, and that toaster has a computer chip in it. And so you're going to have this imbalance between how much computer chips are available and the demand for computer chips. And really, computer chip makers were caught off guard with the pandemic, and they still have not recouped. They still haven't recovered and made enough computer chips. And then we also have very elevated wages, especially in those in-person services. And it's a function of labor shortages, not having enough people, and then what we're calling the Great Resignation, where people are just quitting. They're like, you know what? I can find a better job for more pay, and so see you later, right? And as a consequence, you can see the different inflation measures in the US rising. So this isn't updated with today's data, but it doesn't look good. What are some of the risks to make inflation higher? Supply chain woes, right? So if China continues to shut down cities, right now, Chengdu, please forgive me, I pronounced that incorrectly. Somebody correct me. Who knows how that's pronounced? Yes, ma'am. Say it again. Say it really loud. Thank you. I can't pronounce it, but she just did. So right now, there are lockdowns happening there. And so you have these repeated risks of lockdowns that affect supply chains. And those supply chains are global, and it causes inflation in the US. Transportation costs, right, and commodity prices, they're starting to come off a little, but they're still super high. And that's still, businesses are saying, we can't handle all this, we're not gonna absorb all this, we're just gonna pass it on to consumers. And we know they're doing this because we asked them, and they said, yes, we are. So again, this hasn't been updated, but this is basically what's happening with inflation. And the way you would look at this is to see how much space the bars are taking. And on the left-hand side, we have goods prices, right? And if you notice that a lot of it's the gray bars, which is food and beverages, and the light blue bars, which is energy. So that's gasoline and other types of energy. So those prices have been driving up costs for consumers. But not only that, if we look on the other side of the page, you have services. The biggest bar is shelter costs, right? And that's shown in the form of rents. And rents usually reflect what's happening with home price valuations with some lag. And so home prices, maybe they've peaked, right, for new and used homes, but we're not going to see that show up or even a deceleration in rents for some time. Now, I actually asked the chief economist of one of the biggest researchers of housing activity, and I said, well, what's the lag? He's like, it depends. Sometimes it's long, sometimes it's short. So we don't know. But certainly shelter costs are a big function of why prices are so high overall. And then you have these other bars, so things like hotels and restaurants and sporting events, all those prices are rising. Why? Because we're out there doing it, right? We're moving away from just buying goods to buying more services. Don't worry, I think we're gonna email this, so here we are, home prices. So on the left-hand side, you can see that home prices rose very quickly over the span of just 2 years, right? Faster than we've seen in other episodes. And so we don't know how far or when they're gonna fall. But on the other side of the page, you can see that shelter costs are still rising because those rents, essentially both actual rent, so many of you are paying actual rent, and there's something called imputed rent, which is essentially if you own a home and you rented it, what kind of rent would you receive, right? So those are imputed rents, and then you have the actual rent. So I'm sure most people, under 25 are paying actual rents. But those are still rising, and even in today's report for the CPI, it's still going up. Okay, now we have the fun stuff. We'll talk about this later, professors, at dinner. There's really no slack in the labor market. It's very tight. And how do we determine that? Well, we look at the unemployment rate, the actual unemployment rate, and we compare that to the natural rate, which is essentially the rate of unemployment that doesn't create inflation. Hopefully I got that right. Anybody paying attention? Give me a thumbs up on that. Okay, don't worry about it. But essentially, when I compare them for these different ethnic groups, you don't see a gap. Only for black workers, there's still a gap there. But it's come back down to where we were before the pandemic, right after we had that huge spike. And when we look at something called the Phillips Curve, which is essentially the relationship between the unemployment rate and inflation, I think we have a new Phillips Curve. So what I did was I took the Phillips Curve and broke it up into different time periods. And you can see that the little dotted lines, that's the slope, flattened out over time. And the gray area, that's 1995 through March of last year. And so what it's telling us is that the unemployment rate can go very low without creating a whole lot of inflation. And I think a big function of that is because the Fed beat inflation back in the early 1980s, and everyone trusts that they can keep inflation low and prices steady and predictable. But then the red dots, that's April of last year through July of this year. And you see clearly that there's kind of a new curve, and it's pretty steep. So that means that there's been, like, the Phillips curve is alive again, right? But it's a combination of both demand and supply factors that cause that shift. But the point is that some of this is related to the labor market being very tight. Not all of the inflation, but some of it is that supply issue of not having enough workers, right? And guess what? Quitters do win. So I just highlighted some data here that shows people who stayed in their jobs saw a 1.9% growth rate in their wages from one year to the next. And people who switched jobs saw 3%. So quitters actually did win this round. And so we have a lot of people quitting. And so what businesses are doing to prevent people from quitting is raising wages and offering bonuses and all sorts of benefits, both financial and non-financial, to get people to stay. And that is an input cost, right? That means everything is more expensive for your business. And what are businesses doing with those higher input costs? They're passing them on to you. So that's why consumer inflation is also rising. And so here we have labor shortages. The long and short of this is that this is called JOLTS data. It's from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and it just shows how many jobs are available relative to jobs that have already been filled. So these are job ads. And so you have a number of open positions in these industries, and many of these industries that have the most open positions are in-person services, right? So if you're a nurse or a doctor, you know, especially if you're a surgeon, you can't, well, I guess you could use robotics, but if you're a nurse, you can't necessarily work from home, right? You have to physically go to the healthcare facility. If you work at a restaurant, you can't work remotely, right? If you are a janitor in an office building, you have to physically be there. So many of the areas where you see open positions, right, are in these in-person services and manufacturing, where you physically have to be there. And so you still have these labor shortages, even though businesses are saying we're facing a recession. And as a consequence, wages are rising. So what I did was I indexed wage average hourly earnings. So basically I said if you start in October of 2020, how fast did these wages grow for different industries? And if you notice the yellow line on the left, that's leisure and hospitality, basically hotels and restaurants. Their wages have risen the most because it's been so hard to find workers, right? And so companies are offering all sorts of incentives. And you'll notice that wages rose pretty quickly for other in-person services like transportation and warehousing, right? So Amazon and Target, in retail, had these ads saying, this is what we're going to pay you, right? If you come and work for us because we can't find you. And then I mentioned price spiral. So a wage spiral is when wages rise because wages are rising. So for example, you work for your professor, or you work down at Starbucks, and you see the new person coming and making more money than you do. Well, that's not fair. So you go to your professor or your manager and you say, well, I want a raise. And so because your professor or your manager are afraid you're going to leave, they give you a raise. But then, your line manager is like, well, that's not fair. The people who work under me are getting more money. I want more money too. And so wages are rising because other wages are rising. Then you have a price spiral where prices are rising because other prices are rising. So for example, commodity prices like gasoline rises. So all of a sudden, if you're a business, you have to spend more money moving your product. And so what do? You charge your customers more money. And the customers can be either you or another business. And so prices over here are rising, so that forces prices over here to rise. Wage price spiral is that negative feedback loop that I talked about earlier. And the Fed does not want that to happen, right? Because then it just gets out of control. What's going to cause inflation to be higher going forward? I think the years or the era of very low inflation are over, and that we're going to have inflationary pressures going forward. And maybe the Fed is going to have to recognize that. I don't know. Right now they're saying they want to get prices back to their 2% target. But they may ultimately say, well, anything between 2 and 3 is okay. I don't know. But the key thing here is that millennials, okay, who's a millennial here? Raise your hand. Okay, so there's a lot of Gen Zs, right? Well, you millennials are starting to turn 40, your older brothers and sisters, and that's peak time for buying a house. And over the next 20 years, you're going to have 75 million millennials turning 40. And so you're going to have this persistent demand and need for housing. Meanwhile, we haven't built enough. So that causes inflation. Labor shortages, right? So we have all these folks who are getting older. So if we look at this chart on the right-hand side, if you go back 20 years or even 40 years, you had roughly four working people per every retired person. Fast forward to now, you have 3. 20 years from now, you're just going to have 2. So unless we make some big policy changes like reforming immigration, or we find ways to bring more people who were sidelined into the labor market, or everyone has more children, we're going to have this problem with insufficient labor, and that means upward pressure on wages, which means upward pressure on inflation. And then we have something called deglobalization. Okay, who's an international trade person guru? Okay, nobody? All right. But anyway, deglobalization is just a catch-all for a bunch of stuff, right? Where businesses, for example, with industrial policies, are forced to basically move their factories out of certain countries and bring them home, or move them to countries that, the US is friendly with, right? All that costs money, and it means it was over in, another country because it was cheaper to make there. So if we bring it home or move it to a third country, it's potentially more expensive. And what do businesses do with higher input costs? They pass it on to you. And then there's a transition from fossil fuels to renewables. Why is that inflationary in the short run? Because you have to buy all new stuff, right? If you're a company and you're using a bunch of cars and trucks that use gasoline, and now you need to use EVs, well, you need to buy a bunch of EVs. That's expensive. If you're a consumer, it means that, you have to swap out your boiler for solar panels, and all that's very expensive. So I think I'm out of time. Yeah? So the rest of it's just labor shortages, deglobalization, industrial policies. To leave on a happy note, we can have lower inflation. Here's a laundry list, okay? If we could end the pandemic, end the war, that would be awesome. But right now, we're just seeing tighter policy, right? And so interest rates going higher, and that's gonna cool inflation. Over the longer run, I just wanna point out one thing, remote work, right, is disinflationary, right? Because you can hire workers anywhere. And then also automation, where you don't hire workers and you have the attack of the machines. Okay, on that note, I'll stop talking and do we have time for a few questions? Awesome, thank you. And thanks you two for giving me thumbs up. And thank you, young lady, for translating.
So our first question is fiscal policy such as the Inflation Reduction Act and student loan forgiveness working against the Fed's attempts to lower inflation?
Ooh, now we're getting political. Okay, well, if you think about it in general terms, government spending increases GDP. And when you have faster growth, that tends to cause inflation, right? And so, anything that strengthens demand, so for example, student loans, it depends. Does it mean that someone who was paying, $1,000 a month now has that free $1,000 to spend on something else? Then that generates demand and that generates inflation, right? Or is it the case that they didn't have the $1,000 in the first place and so there's no new demand generated? When it comes to government spending and investment, certain types of investment generate inflation and other types don't. So infrastructure, lots of times people think of that as a good investment and that lowers inflation over time because you're building new roads. So if you don't have potholes and you have new venues, it makes it easier for businesses to transact and ship things, and so that helps lower costs. So it really depends. It's not, a black or white answer there, but, certainly if you run a basic model and you throw in more government spending, inflation goes up. But again, it's really the quality and the type that matters.
Our next question is, how should government policy have responded due to the COVID shock that we experienced to present the inflationary problem that we face now? For example, should the Fed have raised interest rates sooner, or is this inflationary problem inevitable? Okay,
more politics. All right, so I have to admit I'm a Fed apologist because I work there. They're super smart people. Okay, but they're also human beings, and human beings can make mistakes. Now, I never worked for the federal government. I worked for the Fed, which was quasi-governmental. And there are also people who were super smart, and everybody makes mistakes. But I would say, and this is a personal opinion, that the way the federal government and the Fed responded to the pandemic was the right thing to do. So essentially, you had the government, state and local governments mainly saying, you cannot go to work. Businesses, you must close. And so when you think about tort law, there's gotta be some redress. So that means the government needs to step in and support the businesses that are forced to close and support the consumers who lose their jobs. And so it was the right thing to do to issue checks, right? That's kind of the fastest way to stimulate the economy out of all the different types of fiscal stimulus that you can use. That's in contrast to Europe, where they said you cannot lay anybody off. And you still have to pay them, but you can reduce their hours, right? So you didn't have massive unemployment, but you still didn't have people working because their hours were reduced. In the US, there was no such thing. Businesses were allowed to let people go. And so it was the right thing to do for the government to put cash in the hands of business owners and consumers to buy them over until the restrictions were lifted. Now with the Fed, it made sense. The Fed, some of us weren't around, we weren't born, we were very young during the last recession, but a lot of people think that, when you have a crisis, don't wait, go big. right now. And so the Fed slashed interest rates, they built up the size of its balance sheet, and they threw all the stops at it, created liquidity and credit facilities, all sorts of things to soften the blow of the pandemic recession. Now the question is, well, did they wait too late to start unraveling all that? I would say that, you know, in the grand scheme of things, 3 months, 6 months really doesn't matter a lot. But initially, many Fed people thought that this was going to be transitory, right? That the supply drivers of inflation were going to go away quickly. But guess what? They didn't. We had Delta, and then we had Omicron, so the pandemic didn't go away. You still had shutdowns and supply disruptions, and guess what? We had a surprise war, right? That also caused more disruptions. And so it was a series of bad events that kept happening that meant the inflation didn't go away, at least the supply side drivers. But the Fed kind of doesn't have control over supply side drivers, except for the labor markets through reducing demand. And, you know, when consumers demand less, businesses respond by hiring fewer people. It's very indirect. But for the most part, the Fed can't do anything about a war on the other side of the world or economies shutting down on the other side of the world. The Fed can only really have, you know, direct influence on interest rates. And interest rates are used for financing homes, cars, investments. Right? So by the time the Fed realized, oh, gee, this isn't going away, and oh, by the way, inflation's, you know, getting away from us, inflation had gotten away from them. And so they've now, in response, gotten a religion. They're like, you know what? You know, we achieved the full employment mandate. The unemployment rate's below 4%. Most people are back working. We need to focus on inflation because guess what? Having runaway inflation is worse than a little bit of unemployment. So, I guess you could give them brownie points for ultimately coming to the realization, you know, but again, some people would say they were behind the curve, they waited too late, you know, they were too optimistic, et cetera. But again, they're human beings. And even I thought for a period of time, some of this is gonna go away. But there are a lot of things that aren't gonna go away. And as I mentioned, some types of inflation that are gonna be with us for the foreseeable future.
In your recent article, U.S. CEOs say they are preparing for a brief recession, or brief and shallow recession. Only 7% of CEOs said that they don't expect a recession. Why do you think that is?
That's referencing our data. I had a chart there, so thank you. So I think some people think that the Fed may be able to achieve something called a soft landing. And a soft landing is essentially they're able to raise interest rates, bring down inflation, but not cause a recession. And certainly that's possible if the Fed doesn't go all in, meaning the Fed doesn't raise rates to 4% or more. And maybe the Fed blinks and just stops kind of where we are. And some people in financial markets think that's possible. Why? Because ever since the Great Recession, that's what the Fed's done. Whenever the economy, they start raising rates and the economy or financial markets get upset and get nervous, the Fed's like, okay, we're sorry. But this time, officials are saying, we're not gonna be sorry. You're on your own, financial markets, and we may have some pain, meaning there's gonna be some unemployment. Because we need to tackle inflation to the ground. That's a worse problem than, you know, financial assets, you know, losses of financial assets for wealthy people, and even, you know, some measure of unemployment for people who aren't wealthy, but still most people working, right? Okay, and I can also answer questions over here while you eat.
Considering that euros, yuans, and RMBs depreciate against the US dollar while the Fed is increasing interest rates, will there be higher global instability in capital markets?
Higher global instability? Okay, so great question. The US dollar has been appreciating since February 2021, but it really took off after March. Why? That's when the Fed started raising interest rates. And so the US dollar has been appreciating, and differentials between the Fed funds rate and policy rates of other central banks is one element of that determines where currencies go. There are lots of things. There's like 20 different things, but that's one of them. And so when you have very strong, when you have the US dollar appreciating very rapidly, that on the other hand causes depreciation among free floating and floating currencies. And actually the renminbi, or at least the yuan, is technically pegged to the dollar, so we haven't seen that much depreciation there because they're just kind of moving with the US dollar. But any currency that's not pegged or attached, linked to the US dollar, has depreciated. That causes inflation in those countries. Why? Because if they want to import things, and those things are in US dollars, they need more money, right? And so that causes inflation, and their central banks have responded by raising interest rates. So, yes, it's caused instability in a number of economies that, we're seeing higher inflation because of not only the supply side shocks, but also the shock of the US dollar appreciation. So we're kind of already seeing the instability and central banks responding to that. Okay, thank you.
All right, thanks, Tara, for a fantastic talk, and Nisha and Phil for collecting the questions, and Tara Ninman from the Department of Economics organized this all, so thanks to Tara. Food is over there. Phil and Nisha still have a stack of questions, so if you're one of the ones who wrote a question, Dana is available to answer it face to face. So thank you all for coming.